Good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely being here, and it's great to hear the previous speakers talk about ancient woodland, and it just reminded me why, as a kid, I was really fascinated in these ancient landscapes and what went on in them. What were the sounds and the smells and the sensations being there, be it a prehistoric, fern forest way back when dinosaurs were roaming the world, or indeed the ancient woodlands that we had in Ireland. And I remember as a kid always looking around trying to see, you have a picture of an artist's rendition of some ancient habitat, ancient landscape, and I'd always try to look around the corner to see if I could see a bit more of what was there, because just the feelings of wonder that it instilled in me. So it's lovely to be reminded about that here, listening to the previous speakers. I'm also aware that I'm speaking kind of on behalf of a whole group of people, many of who are in this room, who've been working with us on the Native Woodland Scheme for the last 25 years. So there are lots of people in this room, of course, including Joe and Jenny and John Cross and Declan Little and Declan Cook, and lots of people who are here. So I hope I do is all proud. And also speaking with Catherine Duff, who's ecologist with the Forest Service, and my colleague, and she works very closely with us on the Native Woodland Scheme, looking at projects from the ecological point of view. So it's a joint presentation. So any questions, luckily myself and Catherine will be there to field them. So we'll share that burden. But I wanted to go through very quickly, and I realise I have to go through it quite quickly, what's now available under the forestry programme for funding native woodland. And just to kind of reiterate, like the last 25 years or 24 years have been really exciting, I think, for native woodlands in the country, for lots of different reasons. Huge energy, we got lots of different people in all quarters. So just a quick slide, this is building on what's been going on over the last 25 years, which itself built on pioneer projects that happened before then. So it's just great to see all this energy continue with such a well attended conference. It really kind of speaks to the interest out there. So quick recap, before the scheme launched in November 2001, thanks Joe, you corrected me last time, 2000, it was funded for native woodland establishment, new native woodland on greenfield sites basically, and also conservation, basically taking an existing forest, it could be native woodland that needed to be restored. It could have been a conifer plantation which would be felled and replanted with native woodland, or something like emergent woodland, which, emerging woodland in a field that may not have been worked on recently, and how to bring that woodland into the fold, if you like, as an emerging native woodland that needs to be protected. To what we have now under the forestry programme, which runs from 23 to 27. So we're almost approaching the midterm review. It's amazing how quickly time passes. But I wanted just to point out which parts of the programme is there available for funding. And I think just hearing about the kind of demands that we all have to meet as a nation in terms of the nature restoration law and restoring our Annex 1 woodland habitats. We'd hope that some of the funding mechanisms that I'm going to go through here will have direct relevance to make some of that work happen. And I think maybe a significant amount of that work can be funded with the kind of schemes that I'm going to go through now. But first of all, establishment. This is developing a new native woodland on a greenfield site. So you're looking at a field typically. And there are around 12 forest types available under the forestry scheme currently. And native woodland planting accounts for 3 of those. There's FT1, which is just your standard native woodland planting, and there's complexities there I'll go into. FT2 is planting native woodland for water protection, and our colleague Andrew Kerwin will speak about that tomorrow, but basically trying to unleash all the different benefits that native woodland has in terms of water quality. Number 3 is planting on public land. This is where we have agencies like Irish Water or the HSE, Transport Infrastructure Ireland, who have sites and they want to plant native woodland to meet their own goals regarding carbon and biodiversity and water, etc. And also, of course, we have an FT, a forest type involving expansion of existing neighbour woods. So you're planting for amenity woodland. And just the nature of these projects, invariably they are native in nature, because that's what communities involved typically want, which is, again, harking back to a real deep love for native trees that we have in the country. But just to mention very briefly, just to flick onto FT2, which is native woodland for water. And again, Andrew will go into detail tomorrow, but this has an extra payment. And by the way, the grants and premiums for native woodland afforestation are higher than any of the other FTs. So, it's really attractive now for farmers and other landowners to come into it. There's a big drive to try to encourage people to do so. But in terms of using native woodland for water, just 2 slides here. This one is the same site. It's Ballyvarry in County Mayo. It's one that Joe worked on with the Joyce brothers at the time, who still own it. And basically you had a site beside the water up here on the top, and you can see, a bit of cattle poaching at the edge, that kind of thing. And with the establishment grant pulled down, you can see the result of that in the bottom, where you have a vibrant native woodland, you have a water setback which has become vegetated naturally, it won't be disturbed, and all of that has a lot of different protective functions in terms of water quality. So that particular FT is trying to unlock that whole niche, and Andrew will talk about it tomorrow. Moving on, I mentioned emergent woodland, where we're looking at existing young native woodland emerging from the landscape, and there's funding under a forest type for that also, in terms of trying to bring it into active management. And it might be very little. It might just need to be fenced, for example. It might need a little bit of reinforcement planting or removal of some non-natives, but it's trying to bring that into the fold. And also we have particular scheme now for replacement. I mentioned before the old native woodland conservation scheme funded the replacement of conifer stands with native woodland, and this now exists in its own scheme alongside 2 other applications, the climate resilience scheme. So basically under this scheme, which has just opened up in the last couple of weeks, we're looking at offering funding for owners of conifer stands in key locations to reforest with native woodland. So the idea is that there's extra compensation there, which will make it that bit more attractive for people to go down the native woodland route compared to reforesting with conifers, for example. Other supports that are very relevant in terms of native woodland, we have a scheme for continuous cover forestry for, I mentioned the neighbourhood scheme for planting new neighbourhoods. We have one for existing neighbourhoods, and again, a huge focus on trying to make these more native in character to increase their attractiveness to the user groups. Support for seed stands, for tree nurseries, and also this Woodland Environmental Fund, whereby we are encouraging corporations, ideally local businesses, to top up the grant that we give the owner of the land, to encourage them to make the decision to plant native woodland. So you have this kind of relationship forming between the business and the forest owner, for a number of years, whereby the company can use its association with the woodland to show its credentials to its customers, etc. And the forest owner themselves, they get extra payment, and they also have this association with the business, which can lead to other things. So it's an attempt to try to bring the corporate world into what we're doing to try to make more native woodland happen on the ground. But one scheme that's missing from all of that, and just one I'd like to focus on now, is what we do at restoration. Now we have a particular scheme for it called the Native Woodland Conservation Scheme, and this is very, very much focused on restoring existing native woodland. And just to go back just a little bit, in terms of recapping as well, I want to stress the importance of the relationship with our scheme partners in terms of developing all these measures. Woodlands of Ireland, National Parks and Wildlife, Quilcha, Irish Water, Fisheries, a whole bunch of different entities have come in behind us to develop this scheme over the last 20-25 years. So I just want to acknowledge that. And all the benefits from that, I think it's the way that schemes should be run, where you have a real integrated feedback loop from people who are very involved in applying the scheme. And also, the kind of support that Woodlands of Ireland provides in terms of holding events like this, for example, technical publications like its information note series, outreach with local people who might be interested in getting involved in schemes. All of that is really, really valuable in terms of making us move the scheme forward. So that's very important. So just going back to the Native Woodland Conservation Scheme. Okay, I mentioned this is focused specifically on existing native woodland that are in need of restoration. And it's about promoting Ireland's native woodland resource, obviously, but also looking to see how native woodlands can contribute in terms of other ecosystem services. I mentioned water quality, soil protection, wider biodiversity linkage in the landscape, for example, and also amenity, of course. And also where compatible, just to kind of explain this, we do allow production in these woodlands. We're not saying to the owner, you've got funding under the scheme to restore the woodland and now you cannot derive any sort of income from it. We are saying that if it's compatible with the biodiversity objectives, and if you do it using continuous cover forestry techniques, which respect the ecosystem and maintain the ecosystem of the woodland, it may be appropriate to realise timber, wood products, non-wood products, and there are examples there as well from the forest. It won't always be compatible. For example, Jenny was talking earlier on about woodland, and I think that's just such a specific niche. I can't imagine, us being happy with any sort of production of timber products from that. Same maybe with bog woodland because of difficulties with extraction. Obviously it's not going to be compatible. But in a lot of situations it is, and in that way there's a basis for income generation for the owner that's going to take the woodland management forward beyond the lifetime of the scheme. So that's something that we've maintained throughout the whole 25 years as a key characteristic of the Native Woodland Scheme. So people have mentioned earlier on the ecological value of these woodlands. I don't need to recap. Maybe just point out, the biodiversity in the soil, the biome, it's fantastic. I'm going over topics that people here in the room are far more experienced and knowledgeable than I am. But I want to just point out water protection. The idea that if you have an existing native woodland that's, let's say, infested with rhododendron, has very little ground vegetation, heavily grazed by deer, the ecological function of that woodland in terms of water quality is very impaired. Whereas if you can bring it back into being a healthy woodland ecosystem, well, you have this type of thing up here on the top right-hand side. From taken near Lara. It's a National Parks and Wildlife Nature Reserve where obviously the woodland is functioning and you get a much greater level of protection in terms of other ecosystem services. Carbon's very important, that was mentioned earlier on, and also landscape. And that hooks very much into the whole cultural significance that native woodland has, the heritage value of it. The folklore, the history, the local associations, place names, you name it. There's so much there, I think, within the Irish psyche in terms of woodlands and trees, you see that when you see the public response to various tree initiatives and local response to situations where trees are threatened, for example. Okay, need for restoration. I don't need to go through these. It's gone through already very much by people before me. Rhodo overgrazing by deer, of course, list very, very highly in the list of issues. And the overall approach that we have with applicants coming in for funding under the Native Woodland Conservation Scheme is kind of a two-step process, and it involves an ecologist and a forester working with the owner. And so they have to follow particular templates that come with the scheme in terms of the Native Woodland plan that they submit to us for evaluation. And that includes an ecological element which basically goes through the woodland ecosystem and identifies what the ecological priorities are for that particular woodland. And it could be controlling deer, it could be looking at rhododendron, it could be any number of factors. And then the second stage is how best do we therefore deal with those issues and achieve those objectives with the knowledge of the ecologist and also the knowledge of the forester in terms of what are the silvicultural options? What are the options regarding carrying out a certain operations? Is there appropriate machinery that could be useful? There's a whole kind of gambit of decisions that have to be made there as well, with input from the forester. So if any, I guess in any sphere of activity, I think native woodlands really need that ecologist and forester interaction. And, we really see that working very well now. After 20 or 25 years, there are multiple examples of this working really, really well in the field because you have that two-step approach. And behind that also is the owner, because the owner has to be happy with what's going on. They have to be happy with the objectives. They have to be confident that this isn't going to become more of a liability in the future. So the owner is, of course, the missing component from that particular slide. So the owner, the ecologist and the forester are all together working on what's appropriate for the woodland and how we bring it about. There's key elements behind the Native Woodland Conservation Scheme. For example, we have a maximum of 15 hectares per application per owner, and that's because we don't want huge applications coming into us, so big that people aren't able to complete them and draw down the grant aid. We feel that 15 hectares is a small enough, it's a significant enough area, but it's an area that can be done, inverted commas, in terms of gone through the scheme and funding released before they move on to the next 15 hectares in the property. So in this way, they can move through an area bit by bit as opposed to putting the whole lot in and then getting all tied up in terms of not meeting the standards that we have to release grant aid, and at the same time having to pay operators and having to do the next step of the scheme. So this 15 hectares is very much there for a purpose. The last one there, for example, must be doable. There are parts of the country where, because of the rhododendron issue, or because of you're within a deer hotspot, it's not really practical to consider restoring a woodland at this stage without this kind of wider landscape approach, and putting taxpayers' money into something that's not doable is not the way to go. It's only going to create rancor and a failed project. So we have to be careful about what's realistic as well in those particular situations. So, those are some of the key elements. I mentioned the ecologist and the forester and the owner working together, very important. They follow a native woodland plan template, which has been put together by us with Woodlands of Ireland and input from National Parks and Wildlife. There is a list of eligible operations. There are bits and pieces there. For example, luckily the scheme is now on a GIS-based system that the Forest Service use, the inspectors and ecologists use for evaluating applications, called iForest. And this is a big improvement from very recently, like 2 years ago, when this scheme was paper-based, and it was basically lost between the cracks very much as we dealt with other licensing priorities. And now we're operating to the Farmers Charter, where we have to turn around applications which don't involve appropriate assessment, full appropriate assessment, within 6 months. But if that project is screened in for appropriate assessment, the Farmers Charter is talking about a 9-month turnaround time. So in terms of what owners have gone through previously with applications under the scheme, we very much believe that the experience people have now will be much better and much quicker. So, please, if you do know of people who might be looking to apply under the scheme, do give them that encouraging nod, because the experience, we hope, will be far better than it has been over the last number of years. One or two more important things, just in terms of the ecological principles. There's this thing called the Native Woodland Framework that underpins all of the different elements of native woodland within the entire programme. We're basically looking at the soil and vegetation, elevation and other factors. The most appropriate native woodland type is identified. And from there's a list of species that are planted or that have to be encouraged for that particular woodland. So this is a key part of the Native Woodland Scheme family and native woodland conservation. And very quickly, the forester and ecologists go through a drop-down where they look at the location, soil, main habitat types, identified as scenario 2, which is brown podzolic, and from there, it identifies what the most appropriate native woodland type, or what native woodland type you'd find there naturally, and from there, how do we take the first step in beginning to recreate that with a kind of a starter kit of trees and the percentage of the species mix. And we are very aware that this is only the first step. If we plant something that, it's not an old oak woodland overnight. It's going to take many years and several decades, I think, before Ireland can consider it in the Article 17 reporting structure. But it is a first step on in terms of expanding that particular habitat. But the Native Woodland Framework is a key part of all of the different elements of the Native Woodland Scheme across the entire programme, including native woodland conservation. 2 slides more. The funding there is €6,000 per hectare for private applicants over 2 instalments, and there's also a €650 per hectare premium for the private woodland owner under the scheme for 7 years. It's less for public bodies, but for private applicants, that's the level of funding. And it is very important in the Native Woodland Plan template. you are asked what the objectives are, again based on what the ecological priorities were for the woodland. And we use that as a basis for deciding whether or not the project has been a success in terms of releasing grant aid. So it's very important that those objectives are realistic and they're very grounded, but we move on that basis in terms of releasing grant funding. And very important, and this is something that Catherine has worked on tirelessly for the last while, the quality of what comes in really affects how quickly we can move an application through the system. So there's a real focus on the Native Woodland Plan template. The ecological elements of it now reflect what was used during the National Survey of Native Woodland so it has wider application, potentially with the owner's permission. But a big emphasis on clear maps, on consistency between sections, on very clear information on the felling license being included with the application so that we can look at both applications together. So a huge focus on trying to make sure what comes in is concise, consistent, the maps are all very clear, the photographs are well labelled. It's all very basic stuff, but you'd be amazed at the complexity that something ill-prepared can create within the Forest Service, because we're sending out incomplete projects to referral bodies. You know, there's further information required letters that have to go out, and that just really gums up the whole process. So for us to achieve our 6-month and 9-month targets, we really do need what comes in to be as per the guidelines that's provided with the templates. There are template maps there for people to follow, so you know what the standard is. And also, second last slide, there's lots of technical information out there as well in support of ecologists and foresters who are developing applications with owners under the scheme. There's of course the information notes that Woodlands of Ireland provide, and that came with everyone's pack. 2 very recent ones: the management of deer in native woodland, how do you design your woodland to facilitate the control of deer, and very, very recently look back at various case studies from an earlier iteration of the native woodland scheme. So that's really worthwhile in terms of looking back and seeing how they fared, and the pitfalls and the benefits and what have you that those particular projects faced. So that's a really exciting case note added to that collection. There's also this publication here that I did with this gentleman here, John Cross, but just a wealth of information there in terms of management guidelines for native woodland aimed at the practitioners, and also at the bottom there, the Native Woodland Conservation Scheme Manual that sets out the standards for that scheme, and also it contains a template for the Native Woodland Plan that forms a core part of the application under the Native Woodland Conservation Scheme. So I think on behalf of myself and Catherine, thank you very much.